All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Offshore Wind Forum, Part 1. Part 2 will be on March 16th, and we hope you tune in. This is hosted by the Southport-Oak Island Area Chamber of Commerce and in partnership with the Chambers for Innovation and Clean Energy. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers, including a fellow chamber director who is joining us by phone because he's out on the island today in Block Island and he might not have internet service. So he has been through this process and firsthand experience in offshore wind. So we're very excited to have him with us as well. We ask that you do remain muted during the presentations and put any questions in the chat. And when we get to the questions portion of the program, we'll call upon you to ask your questions to the panel. So let's get to it. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for today. That's Susan Munroe with the Chambers for Innovation and Clean Energy, a nationwide network of 1,300 chambers of commerce and economic development organizations. It works with these associations to amplify and advance the equitable clean energy economy while highlighting business leadership in the areas of clean energy, climate action, and resilience. Good morning, Susan.
Oh, Karen, thank you so much for having us today. We're excited to be with Southport-Oak Island Chamber. My parents lived on the island for quite a while, so it's near and dear to my heart. And hopefully, I hope to make it back there sometime soon on a more permanent basis. But meanwhile, we'd love to vacation there and spend time there. So thanks for being with us today. I think Karen reviewed a little bit about Chambers for Innovation and Clean Energy, and I'll move in specifically to offshore wind, which is why we're all here today. We've been engaging with chambers and economic development groups for a while now, up and down the East Coast, and there's been a lot of involvement with chambers of commerce and economic development in that space. And I want to really applaud Karen's leadership here with the Southport-Oak Island Chamber as just being a convener of stakeholders, just to make sure that we have accurate information and we have the opportunity just to lay that groundwork of education and engagement with residents and stakeholders. So thank you, Karen, again. And what we're going to talk today a little bit about is the development of offshore wind in North Carolina. And then we're going to bring it, we're going to get a little bit more specific to talk about the specific project development in the Southport-Oak Island Chamber, specifically Wilmington West. This is a two-part series. We could easily make it 3, 4, or 5, but we're going to condense it into 2 opportunities. Today, we're really going to talk about an overview of what the project looks like and get more into a little bit of the environmental concerns, and we'll touch on fishing as well, recreational fishing specifically. March 16th, one of the greatest opportunities for your area, region, and of course the state. We'll talk about the economic impact and the job creation opportunities, and we'll feature Colin Kaiser from the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina. Just to give you a sneak peek of that, there's 55 companies in North Carolina that manufacture some of the 8,000 components that are in an offshore wind turbine. And so we'll be discussing all things, not only the economic impact of the actual development, but of the opportunity that North Carolina and your region can play in the supply chain opportunity. I don't want to steal Colin's thunder, so you'll just have to tune in on the 16th for that. But today, I'm going to introduce our speakers, and they'll give you a little bit of background about the work that they do. First, we'll have Jaime Simmons. Jaime is the program manager with that Southeastern Wind Coalition. And we're also pleased to have with us Jennifer Mundt, the newly appointed Assistant Secretary of Clean Energy Economic Development for the North Carolina Department of Commerce. And then we'll feature Amber Hewett, Program Director offshore wind with the National Wildlife Federation. And as our special guest for our Q&A section, as Karen introduced, Lars Trodson. Lars is the Economic Development Director with Block Island Chamber of Commerce in Rhode Island. And some of you may know that they have a small project not that far offshore from Block Island. So we're excited to hear from him today. So we are going to kick it off with Jaime Simmons. Jaime, thank you for being here.
Of course. Thanks, Susan. And thanks, Karen in the Southport-Oak Island Chamber for having me. Let me see if I can get this up and running. Like that's not my right one. Here we go. How's that look?
Great.
Good. Perfect. All right. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks again, Susan. So I appreciate y'all having me join you today. I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about the history of offshore wind, why it's a critical technology, and why we're seeing the adoption and scale of it now here in the US, and then a bit of a status update, as Susan mentioned, on the projects anticipated off the coast of North Carolina. Great. So first, just a quick introduction to myself and the Southeastern Wind Coalition. Again, I'm Jaime Simmons. I'm the program manager with SCWC. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based here in North Carolina. Though our footprint does span the 11 states of the Southeast, myself, I do focus the majority of my time here in North Carolina specifically. And our goal is to advance land-based and offshore wind. And we do that mainly by serving as conveners of stakeholders and through information dissemination like we're doing here today. We are not a trade association. We also aren't developers of projects, though we do have developers as members. We also have utilities as members, other NGOs, economic developers, community organizations, and many other stakeholders that are represented by us through our membership. So I like to say that we approach our work as advocates of wind, but also advocates of the Southeast and its ratepayers, residents, and industries too. So we certainly want to see more wind energy, but we want to make sure that it provides the maximum value to all stakeholders in the Southeast and to North Carolina. So just a brief history on offshore wind. So this technology was first deployed back in 1991 off the coast of Denmark. I'm not positive that this is the project, but it's representative of the scale and technology used at the time. So pretty small and demonstration-like in nature. The original motivation was really energy independence. So Europe was a big importer of fuels, and so there was interest in developing generation technologies that weren't reliant on fluctuating fuel prices. Commercial scale development really started taking off in the 90s, late 90s, still in Europe. And that's really when the focus was on scaling the industry through technology innovations, build out of the supply chain, and ultimately working towards bringing down the cost of offshore wind. So in 2017, we saw the first subsidy-free offshore wind project in Europe, and projects continue to be developed at cost that is competitive to wholesale generation prices. So as of today, we have more than 35 gigawatts or 35,000 megawatts of offshore wind deployed worldwide. That would be off the coasts of Europe, South and East Asia, and then Eastern United States, of course. So this is an established technology that's been around for decades, and we're able to realize the fruits of the research and technology advancements that have been developed and honed for many years now. So here's a snapshot of where we are in the US today. This is already dated. We now have more than 6 lease areas that were just leased last week off the coast of New York. I might even, Amber, you can correct me, I might even have Massachusetts state goal wrong. It's hard to keep up because things are rapidly changing, but what we're seeing as the key driver for offshore wind development in the US are these state level development goals. So our neighbors to the north, Virginia, have set a goal of 5,200 megawatts. New York here, you can see has the highest goal of 9,000 megawatts, and most other East Coast states have set respective goals as well. In total, we now have, I believe it's somewhere in the ballpark of 25 wind energy areas in various stages of leasing and development on the East Coast alone. And states across the country, now including the West Coast and the Gulf of Mexico, are setting these goals in part because offshore wind is an essential technology to reach decarbonization goals for the electricity grid. It's got a very steady production profile, not a lot of volatility. It's very complementary to other resources. And even a small project creates a large amount of power. So it's critical to most states that have decarbonization goals, much like North Carolina. And while Susan said we're going to talk about it at length on the 16th and a bit later today, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight that that maybe the primary driver that states have for setting these procurement goals is the economic opportunity. We call it a once in a generation economic opportunity. It truly is. It's in the hundreds of billions. And I mentioned that the industry right now is most established in Europe, and that's where nearly all of the components are manufactured for that reason. However, these components are massive, and to accommodate the pipeline that's clearly continuing to grow here in the US, the supply chain really needs to be a domestic one. And so we're seeing a lot of investment both in these new large component manufacturing facilities, also JV partnerships and smaller components sourcing being awarded to states that are indicating the demand for their product. So this will be an entirely new sector of the economy, and states are really making their best case to recruit as much of the industry as possible by setting these development goals. All right, so on to North Carolina and the landscape for development here. This is a map of what were North Carolina's 3 established wind energy areas. So Kitty Hawk up in the north in orange, and then the 2 Wilmington areas, Wilmington East in the blue, and then Wilmington West in the green. And as of right now, only 2 of these wind energy areas are being pursued. And I'll talk about them specifically here in just a second. But Kitty Hawk, that's Kitty Hawk in the orange, and Wilmington East, which again, that's the one furthest from shore in the blue down south. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, as I will refer to them, is the division of the federal government that's responsible for evaluating, leasing, and permitting offshore energy projects. So that's oil and gas and offshore wind. They leased Kitty Hawk in 2017. And at the time, they decided to postpone consideration of the Wilmington wind energy areas to be conducted in a separate process alongside the state of South Carolina, which also had a number of preliminary wind energy areas. That process was reinitiated in early 2020, and based on further evaluation and stakeholder feedback, updated scientific study, BOEM decided to not move forward with any further consideration of Wilmington West, nor any of the South Carolina wind energy areas at this time. And this was in large part due to their overlap with now designated North Atlantic right whale critical calving habitat. Okay, so just some quick highlights on the 2 proposed projects. So Kitty Hawk, again, was leased in 2017 and awarded to Avangrid Renewables. They'll be developing that project. They're also the developers of North Carolina's only land-based wind project, the Amazon Wind Farm in Elizabeth City. They're anticipating up to 2,500 megawatts of total generating capacity. So for comparison, that's more than double your average gas or nuclear plant. A bit on their timeline. So Avangrid began their site assessment and environmental survey work in early 2019 and submitted their construction and operations plan, which is really kind of the nuts and bolts of the project for just the first 800 megawatts, so a subset of the entire lease area, in December 2020. Though in total, they'll have about 3 years worth of survey data. So that's regarding avian and marine wildlife habitats and migratory patterns, ocean floor and water surveys, and then of course weather data and wind speed data. BOEM also announced their intent to conduct an environmental impact assessment in summer of 2021, which I imagine Amber will briefly touch on what that process is like. And then they're anticipating that should they receive approval of their construction and operations plan, that they could begin construction for that tranche of 800 megawatts as early as 2026. The intent for that section, that subsection of the project, is to be delivered to the Virginia Beach area, though the remainder is still unplanned for the time being. And then their buyer would likely be, just given geographical proximities, Dominion Energy in Virginia or Duke Energy, but there is not yet a contract for that power. So construction wouldn't begin until that took place. I am not going to go into detail about all of these slides. I am not an environmental scientist, but I did want to just throw them in here as a reference point for all of you should we distribute these after the presentation. And mainly for this next slide, because it does have a web link for some publicly available data on both the Kitty Hawk project as well as some surveys conducted on behalf of BOEM in the Wilmington East and South Carolina wind energy areas as well, if you wanted to take a look at that. Okay, so the Wilmington East wind energy area is very similarly sized, just over 127,000 acres. So we would anticipate that a similar generating capacity of just over 2,500 megawatts to be produced from that project, assuming industry standard technology that's being deployed right now. I did forget to mention earlier, but for the same consideration of overlap with right whale critical habitat, a small sliver that's closest to the coastline of the wind energy area was removed from the boundary of Wilmington East. So that actually pushes it even further from shore. So at its closest point, you're looking at almost 18 nautical miles, and that would be from Bald Head Island. And then BOEM has yet to hold an auction for this area. So there's currently no developer that's assumed this lease. And for that reason, there's still a lot of unknowns because there's still a lot of work to be done by ultimately the developer. So there's no cable route or cable landing, onshore landing site. A lot of these commitments to build or source from local suppliers are still many years away, along with any potential investments in say community programs or workforce development. Those are all still to be determined. And just to give a little bit of perspective on that timeline. So from the beginning of the planning process, hey, we want to start scoping out parts of the ocean to steel in the water. Historically, this has been about a 10-year process. Kitty Hawk at the moment is about here. So they're nearing the end of the regulatory process, whereas Wilmington East is right about here. So still very, very early on, many years, and lots of study, evaluation, and engagement to be done by both the developer and BOEM. And then finally, I wanted to draw your attention to these stakeholder engagement icons. These are designated public comment periods that are held by BOEM. Sometimes there are more depending on the circumstances, but there will be a number of opportunities where they'll be seeking input regarding details of the project and their things they should consider in their evaluation. There'll also be a lot of opportunities kind of in this span of time outside of the regulatory process for engagement. So the developer will have their boots on the ground, and will be actively working with the state, the utility, and local communities as their project plans start to materialize. So I think that is all for me for now. I will pass it back to you, Susan.
Hey, and now I think we're going to transition to Jennifer Mundt. Jennifer, thanks, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Susan and Jamie, for that great setup for me. I really appreciate it. And thank you all from Southport-Oak Island for inviting me to participate with y'all. Can everybody see this? Excellent. So, I'll just, again, I'm Jennifer Mundt, Assistant Secretary for Clean Energy Economic Development with the North Carolina Department of Commerce. This is just a quick overview of the content that I want to share with y'all. I was asked to provide some content and overview about where exactly North Carolina stands in terms of its existing state policies and regulations as they pertain to offshore wind, and some of the considerations and issues that are top of mind for us in the Cooper administration. Jamie, I think, did a really excellent job of providing this overview to y'all with regards to the existing wind energy areas that we have already identified off of our coast. I won't spend more than just a minute just discussing these. But what I want to point out, that just to layer on what Jamie shared, is that the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is an agency, or which is an office within the Federal Department of Interior, they lead all of the activities pursuant to the coastal area, or I should say the Outer Continental Shelf, which is defined as areas, at least on the Atlantic coast, that are 3 miles and seaward from the coast. So any activities that are proposed in those areas are going to be under the federal government's jurisdiction. In an effort to ensure that there is complementary and partnered work that happens in order to protect and include state and local and regional interests proximate to those types of projects, BOEM has created what are known as renewable energy task forces. And it's through the ongoing work of these task forces, that the areas go from the inception of an idea to go out to a call area for nominations, and they go through a whittling process, or quote deconfliction process. Right here, as you can see my cursor where I'm pointing, this larger abnormally shaped polygon was the original potential area for development off Kitty Hawk. And as you saw in the previous slides, and as indicated here, the top right corner was what was ultimately decided as feasible and technically viable to develop and go out for leasing. Similarly, you can see what was the original Wilmington East call area, and the dark blue shaded portion is what is now potentially going to go out for lease later this spring. And so I just point this out to clarify that this is a collaborative state and federal process that's underway. It's not BOEM making all of these decisions. It's very much informed and intended to be robust and take enough time such that these areas can be fully vetted before any potential development occurs. I would note that there is a third task force that North Carolina has been included in, and its work has really just begun, and it's called the Central Atlantic Task Force, and it includes potential coastal areas for development off the states of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and the northern OCS areas, or Outer Continental Shelf areas, from North Carolina. So basically from Hatteras Island north. And this map that's listed here, that's included here on the right side of your slide, it is the current status where Bowen is and its evaluation. And that I anticipate that, you know, if this process moves as planned, Bowen may be ready to take some portion of these big red polygons out for potential lease option mid-late 2023. I want to talk a little bit about the state's role here. I would note that North Carolina's offshore wind policies have been years in the making and in the development, and they have been consistent and robust throughout Governor Cooper's term in office, really beginning with Executive Order 80, which he signed in October of 2018, which directed our state's Department of Environmental Quality to create and publish a clean energy plan. That was pushed out in October of 2019, and amongst that plan were several recommendations for the state to take action with regards to offshore wind. One of those recommendations was for the state to partner with other states in a regional effort to promote and amplify the profile of offshore wind, to grow a supply chain, to leverage strengths and collaborate amongst the region, and to really be a force. And so in October 2020, Governor Cooper signed a memorandum of understanding with the governors of Virginia and Maryland, at the time, Governor Northam and Governor Hogan, to create what we call Smart Power, which is the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic Regional Transformation Partnership for Offshore Wind Energy Resources. And then last year, really capping all of the efforts that have been going on to date, in June of 2021, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 218, which for the first time in North Carolina set out development goals for offshore wind. Governor Cooper set a 2030 development goal off of our coast of 2.8 gigawatts and 8 gigawatts by 2040. Again, this puts North Carolina on the map of East Coast states that have set goals for offshore wind development, and that starts the process or the opportunity to provide industry and other stakeholders some of that regulatory certainty that North Carolina is open for business when it comes to offshore wind development. Also contained within Executive Order 218 was Governor Cooper's acknowledgement that this is an interagency endeavor and requires a whole of government approach to address. And so what he did was directed several agencies to identify offshore wind lead staff to raise and address any issues and to stay on top of activities as they take place in the Outer Continental Shelf. Governor Cooper also essentially codified the ongoing work of what is known as the Interagency Offshore Wind Work Group. This is a team of leaders from across the state, the administration, including folks from my agency here at Commerce, the Department of Environmental Quality, our Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, Military and Veterans Affairs, Department of Transportation, our State Ports Authority, and led by staff in the governor's office to make sure that we are all in tune and staying abreast of activities that we should be mindful of going on in other agencies, so that there is an ongoing conduit of information and opportunity to share information across the state. The EO 218 also established NC Towers, which is the North Carolina Task Force for Offshore Wind Economic Resource Strategies, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention some landmark legislation that was signed into law in October of last year, House Bill 951, which sets a course for North Carolina to meet clean energy standards from our power sector. In House Bill 951, Governor Cooper signed into law that North Carolina's power sector is going to strive to achieve the 70% carbon reduction or carbon emissions reductions from the power sector by 2030, and then striving towards full carbon neutrality, 100% carbon neutral. by 2050. And offshore wind ostensibly can play a huge role in meeting those targets. I almost said next slide, but I'm running my own slide. NC Towers, like I mentioned before, it was created or directed, established under Section 3 of Executive Order 218. There are five main focuses for NC Towers, and essentially it's meant to identify economic and workforce opportunities and challenges that are posed by offshore wind. The task force is directed to recommend policies and programs to capture any strategic opportunities that can help us foster a thriving offshore wind workforce and business community, provide advice for developing the supply chain, workforce, and infrastructure necessary for a vibrant offshore wind industry. And within that also, we are working to make sure that we integrate and foster environmental justice and equitable access to communities and underserved, for opportunities for underserved communities across the state, at the coast, and all into the mountains. The membership of NC Towers is diverse. I would note that Jaime, who you just heard from, is one of our members. We have representation from academia, from charter boat fishermen, coastal chambers and business development organizations, the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina, the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, tourism interests, fisheries and other wildlife and natural resources interests. And I know I'm forgetting, so we have folks from the development, offshore wind development community, as well as utilities, all represented on this task force, so that we have we have a lot of expertise to draw from to help shore up what our strategies are going forward. The task force proper meets quarterly, and it was just it held its inaugural meeting just about a month ago in Wilmington, and the task force itself is subdividing into 4 subcommittees that will meet on a monthly basis to tackle discrete topics and questions before the task force. We have a subcommittee on supply chain and business development, a subcommittee devoted to workforce development and training opportunities. We have a subcommittee that is going to address infrastructure and environmental justice, and then a 4th subcommittee dedicated to outreach and messaging. And the task force itself is directed to prepare and submit an annual report to both the governor and the General Assembly on all of its findings and recommendations. Just take a quick minute to note that there are several issues and considerations that are top of mind for Governor Cooper's administration as all of these projects proceed in their various roles. The first is that we are committed to a transparent and inclusive process. The second is we want to see responsible project development that is based in science and data. And we are also committed to ongoing stakeholder engagement. And this applies to all stakeholders with interest with respect to the areas that might be potentially impacted or there might be conflicts with development off the coast, namely fisheries and tourism and other interests. And so I can speak more to that later, but I'm watching the clock and I want to make sure that my colleagues here have time to weigh in with their knowledge and look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Hey, Jennifer, thank you so much. We really want to make sure, and I think Jennifer just started to introduce that, we really want to make sure that we're concentrating today on some of the environmental impacts and taking a look at how that impacts the fishing industry, recreational fishing, charter fishing, and in that sector. So we're going to turn it over now to Amber Hewett with National Wildlife Federation. Thank you, Amber.
All right, thank you. Let me get my screen up here. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, great. All right, well, thank you all so much for having me join you today. I'm Amber Hewett, and I run the National Wildlife Federation's program advocating for the responsible development of offshore wind power. So the most frequent question I get is, why would a wildlife organization support the large-scale development of infrastructure in a fragile, increasingly fragile ecosystem? And that's a good one. The reason that we come to this fundamentally is our foundational belief that climate change is the single greatest threat to wildlife and habitat, and that we need to advance large-scale clean energy solutions that are able to rise to the scale of that challenge. Now, of course, with that, so that's what drives us here. What excites me about offshore wind energy is the abundance of benefits that it can bring both to wildlife and to communities. That we've heard a bit today just about the economic development opportunities, workforce opportunities, and that's all part of our offshore wind campaign. I'm going to focus in the next few minutes specifically on where we engage to ensure that all development is responsible. We come to this driven by a hope to see offshore wind succeed. That is, that's the goal. That said, our support is extremely conditional. Wildlife is our middle name, and we would never support a project that we felt was reckless in any way. We've actually litigated against an offshore wind project in New Jersey that we felt didn't meet our standards of responsible. So all that to say, I hope that we never have to oppose an offshore wind project again. That is a last resort. And if you see that the National Wildlife Federation is supporting an offshore wind project or an endeavor, that it means we've really done a fair amount of scrutiny on the details of said project or exploration. So we've heard a bit about just how far behind the United States is. From Jaime, the industry, while there are thousands of offshore wind turbines spinning around the world, what you see on your screen is the United States' entire offshore wind fleet. So these are 5 turbines on the left off of Block Island, Rhode Island, and then 2 turbines 26 miles off the coast of Virginia. And that's all we've got. National Wildlife Federation started our offshore wind campaign 10 years ago. So I've been here for 9 of those years, and sometimes it's hard for me to think about how few turbines have risen in that decade of my life. But that said, there's an enormous amount of policy and groundwork underway. And what I'm going to talk about today is just the ways that we as a wildlife community engage in the processes that you've heard about from Jaime and Jennifer. We are really enthusiastic about bringing the scale of offshore wind development to most recently the Biden administration's goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030. So 30,000 megawatts from where we are now with those 7 turbines, we're at 42 megawatts, and we are supporting a goal of reaching 30,000 megawatts by 2030. That's an enormous amount of development. We're excited about the opportunity, particularly on the Atlantic coast, where I include this image in every offshore wind presentation because it's really the trifecta of why the US Atlantic coast is so ripe for development. We have on the left, we have the demand close to the supply. We have high wind speeds on the East Coast. I'm joining you from Massachusetts, but all along the East Coast, our high wind speeds are largely offshore, right? Like we have land-based wind resources, but the consistency of our wind resource offshore really stands out. And then on the far right, you'll see just our gradually sloping outer continental shelf, which is not something that every coastline has, right? The West Coast and the Gulf of Maine, where water gets really deep really fast, they'll need to consider floating offshore wind technology. So here is where we are ready to harness existing offshore wind technology that, as Jaime said, has 30 years of proven advancement and improvement starting in Europe. So while we're interested in the future, the next frontiers of floating offshore wind, our engagement to date has really been around existing offshore wind technology because that's what we're really set up for. We have honestly an abundance of wildlife concerns. most notably, the primary example that I'll start with is the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, which migrates all along the Atlantic coast and through almost every area slated for offshore wind development. So this is the first and foremost challenge that we encounter, and it's one that's applicable in all areas. So we run a national offshore wind program. It's something that I think really unites a uniting challenge along the Atlantic coast. Beyond North Atlantic right whales, we do address avian concerns, sea turtles, benthic habitats, fisheries. So the right whale is sort of a unifying example, but just know that our concerns are above water, underwater, near shore, onshore, and I am always happy to dive in on any specific species or category of species that you'd like to learn more about. But that would require hours of our time if I were to go down that path entirely. So really the principles that guide us, all offshore wind development must employ best management practices that are informed by the best available science. So there are a few avenues in which we get at that I'll talk about, but just to continue with our principles here, effective and expert stakeholder engagement is critical. So we've heard about this a bit just from Jennifer. That can happen at the state level, the federal level, that can happen directly with industry. So I'll share a bit about that in a moment. And we always advocate for pre, during, and post-construction monitoring of potentially impacted wildlife populations. So we need to have information on what the state of the species of concern are now, years in advance of development, so that we can continue to evaluate and adapt our recommendations. So, I say that just to say we are always changing, and that's a fair criticism of the environmental community. We're always changing what we ask for, but the conditions of the ocean are always changing. So the need to keep stakeholders at the table every step of the way is really critical, because we need to be bringing in our changing understanding of what the species that are set to be potentially impacted by offshore wind development are enduring. So monitoring can help us just understand and observe this changing state of wildlife health offshore, but monitoring also can be employed as a technology, a technological solution to help mitigate impacts or avoid impacts to wildlife throughout surveying and development. So if a common ask that we have is that wildlife are monitored during loud construction activity or loud survey activity, so that when a species of concern enters into the area, that activity can stop. So I'm talking about both observation to inform our recommendations, but then also observation to real-time observation to alter the activity that's taking place offshore while it's happening. All of our recommendations follow what we call a mitigation hierarchy. So our first goal is always to avoid impact to wildlife, then to minimize, and then to mitigate, although sometimes mitigation is, it's an and or, because in cases where impacts are unavoidable, which, I'm an offshore wind advocate, I won't sugarcoat though, like there will be impact. And when we need to also fully understand what those impacts are, so that we can address or remove other pressures on species if we can. So we are recognizing as wildlife, as the conservation community, that offshore wind is a critical clean energy solution. We're accepting some minimized and avoided risk that will come with that, but also quantifying that so that we can turn to other impacts on wildlife and hopefully remove pressure in other areas so that we're not increasing the burden on already overburdened species. So this mitigation hierarchy that we apply at all stages of development, you saw this slide earlier from Jaime, I'll just pause on it for a moment to note that we apply that hierarchy from the very beginning, from site identification all the way through installation and even to decommissioning. So we, at the siting level, call for avoidance of, this is really about choosing the right location, avoiding critical habitat, avoiding really sensitive areas for wildlife, areas that wildlife depend on for critical activity, whether, and this is this dark blue, the far left section of this process. So that's when we can really weigh in throughout the extensive stakeholder engagement process that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management employs at that time. So we have about 2 years to show up at task force meetings and provide comments at multiple phases and engage directly with BOEM throughout that process to make sure that as they consider what is the area of least conflict, that all wildlife priorities are a layer in that process, and that we are eliminating the areas that are of too great a risk, and hopefully choosing ultimately a wind energy area that the wildlife community can feel as comfortable as possible with. At the construction phase, and I will include in construction surveying, so survey activity, developers get out there once they have their lease and spend years surveying and exploring what the seafloor conditions are, what kinds of projects and foundations they can plan to install. That activity, it's loud, it's disruptive. This is the phase of development, surveying and construction that we are the most concerned with. I should say that once turbines are up and running, our concern is really small. The impact on wildlife is negligible. There will likely be some exceptions in other regions of the country with migratory pathways of birds. But speaking in this part of the country, particularly off of North Carolina, but off of most of the Atlantic coast, the vast majority of our concerns are during the surveying and construction phase. So survey work, right? Like a common question that I get in this space is, how does this compare to, for example, seismic activity for oil and gas exploration? So I'll just answer that up front, that there's really no comparison. It is night and day. I have a marine mammal biologist colleague who compares it, who draws the comparison that it's like an electric scooter and a Mack truck. Seismic activity for oil and gas exploration needs to gather information from miles beneath the seafloor, whereas offshore wind exploration only needs to gather survey data from just a few meters beneath the seafloor. So both the scale of activity and the intensity of what's taking place is different. It's also completely different technology. Rather than air guns, the offshore wind industry uses something called the sub-bottom profiler. We have tons of information on this, so I'm happy to dig into it or provide more follow-up if folks have questions on that. But there's really there's no comparison. The sub-bottom profiler activity does have impact, and we do have parameters that we ask for. Things like, and this is with construction activity as well, things like building your construction schedule around what we know of wildlife migration patterns. So we ask for developers, and we ask of BOEM that they require developers to only do loud underwater activity when we know that, for example, right whales are not expected to be in the area, and of course to monitor for them, because right whales are more than welcome to go off of their migration schedule and show up when we don't expect them. So we ask for seasonal restrictions on loud underwater activity, time of day restrictions, so that developers can always see visibly if a whale is in the area and not start loud construction in nighttime hours, to really be able to clear the area, not clear the area, but ensure that the area is clear before beginning such loud underwater activity. We call for restrictions on vessel speeds. So when we know that right whales are likely to be in the area and vessel strikes are a leading cause of harm or death to not just right whales, but marine mammals in general, we ask for developers to adhere to a 10-knot vessel speed restriction. So I could go on with the measures that we ask for, but I will also note that in operations and maintenance, we still have a set of measures. Although the impact is much smaller at that phase, once the project is up and running, we still have parameters that we ask for around lighting and visibility, but also lighting impact to the night sky, and vessel speed restrictions for crew transfer vessels during the operations and maintenance phase. And then finally, decommissioning and ensuring that the decision there, we are far from ever decommissioning an offshore wind project in the United States. It will be decades before we take on that challenge, but developers are already required to consider that, to have a decommissioning fund and a plan for decommissioning when they are submitting their project plans. And we are always advocating for that to be informed by stakeholder engagement as we learn more about what decommissioning can and should look like. This is the foundation of the Block Island Wind Farm, actually from several years ago, but just 6 months after the foundations were installed, they were really embraced by sea life. And so there's a growing community, mostly of recreational anglers and charter boat captains, that really see the value in what this underwater structure can provide for creating these artificial reefs underwater. And certainly we would not want to see those removed if at a decommissioning phase, once the ocean has really made it their own. So this is I'm wrapping up here. This is my last slide for now, I believe, but I've spoken quite a bit about the way that we engage with the federal government, and all of the measures that I just mentioned really fall under the jurisdiction of the leasing entity, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And so that's the first stop, right? Like to deliver these recommendations to BOEM and have them set these as requirements for all developers, best case scenario. Of course, we also have a lot of levers at the state and industry level. So for example, at the state level, we often advocate for these wildlife protection requirements to be included in procurement policy. So whether that's legislative or administrative, if there's a procurement goal, we want this requirement that best management practices informed by best available science are embedded at that point, because states have a lot of power here. This falls in the jurisdiction of the federal government, but states are the buyers of this power, or the recipients of this power by whatever mechanism they use. You can really set clear standards as to what kind of development a state is comfortable with taking place off their shore. And that's, of course, a place where stakeholder engagement can have a lot of influence. Permitting reviews of the parts of the projects that do come closer to shore and come into state waters or onshore and state land. Consistency review, so states have an opportunity to consider whether federal decisions are consistent with state policy. And that has a public comment opportunity at the state level as well. We're always advocating.
You might have lost Amber.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's telling me to wrap up. I'm like, am I getting a hook? So technical advisory boards, where stakeholders can come to the table, meet with developers and state officials. These are in place in many Northeast states, but I hope to see them established in all states considering offshore wind development. And of course, states can fund critical research. And then finally, we work directly with the offshore wind industry, asking them, when you're not required, sometimes policy doesn't quite match the pace of changing science and ocean conditions. So in the instances where there's not a requirement, but science is telling us that a certain speed restriction needs to be adhered to, we do negotiate directly with developers and ask them to just go above and beyond what's required of them, which might sound like a long shot, but it's really not, because developers recognize that the species we're seeking to protect are incredibly legally protected. And so it's a key part of having a strong wildlife protection plan, is a key part of having a successful project plan. We are already seeing in Massachusetts, for example, the project that's the furthest along, the one fully permitted commercial scale project in the US, has 6 lawsuits, and several of them raise wildlife concerns. So this legal vulnerability is significant, and it brings developers to the table to really get this part right. Developers, of course, conduct their own stakeholder outreach and engagement. And finally, we always press them to invest in research. All right, that's all I've got. Thank you so much.
Amber, thank you so much. I mean, and I want to make sure that our attendees know that this is only the National Wildlife Federation work. There are other environmental groups out there, Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, that are doing similar work to make sure that there are strict standards within the industry and within each offshore wind development. So and it's also, Amber, thank you also for making sure, you know, that we have accurate information today surrounding that issue. We are going to transition to question and answers. We were going to have Jaime come back because Jaime is going to, we'll transition this to the 16th, but so join us on the 16th, where we will actually take a look at simulated views of what offshore wind development would look like off the coast of Southport and Oak Island and in Holden Beach. So you'll have to come back on the 16th to see that. And we'll also hear more about what voters think and what the buzz is. What are people talking about? What are people concerned about? So, but we want to make sure that we have plenty of time today to answer some of the questions that have already been submitted. So I am going to transition it, Karen, back to you. And I think Karen is going to get us started on a couple of questions, and then we will open it up to everyone else.
Thank you. And thank you to our panel of speakers. That was really good information. And I know we had a couple of questions submitted by email. So I also want to get Lars Trodson in here, the president of the Block Island Chamber of Commerce. They have an offshore wind turbines close to their shore. Lars, would you share what your community's experience has been with the fishing since offshore wind development?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's been rather positive, actually. Just to put it in perspective, we have a 5-turbine project that produces 30 megawatts of power. So it's obviously very small, and it's 3 miles offshore. But yes, our small fishing industry, the industrial and as well as commercial and recreational, have been very, very positive about the fisheries that it has been created around the foundations of the 5 turbines.
Lars, has there been any feedback on offshore wind development on Block Island? Like, how's your chamber's relationship with the developer?
Oh, quite good. They're a good corporate citizen. It's transitioned from, it used to be called Deepwater Wind. They were the originators of the project. Now it's Ørsted. And yes, they're very supportive. They're a good corporate citizen. We're good partners with the chamber, supportive of some town events. The turbines have been quite a tourist attraction, I should say, as well. There are tours given out to the wind farm itself, even though they picked a good spot because it's very windy out there. So the water can be choppy, but when you get out there and get underneath these massive turbines, it's quite spectacular. So it's been a boon. I wouldn't say a boon, but it's been definitely an advantage to have the wind farms there in terms of tourism.
Thank you, Lars. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to the discussion today?
I think that as there was a long rollout process for this pilot program. It's recognized that this was in part done to see just how the process would go, all the permitting on the local level, the state level, the federal level, and there was a lot of information sessions, a lot of town hall forums, a lot of back and forth between people who were in favor of the turbines and those that were skeptical or against them. But it was a very good process for Block Island. Very, very, very inclusive. I think very transparent, and and now they've become sort of like the Eiffel Tower. It's people were against it at the beginning, but now it's just a part of life, even for those who are against it.
Thank you. Let's see here. This question might be for Jaime or Jennifer. Some area residents may have concerned that the Wilmington East project is too close to shore, which begins about 17 or 18 nautical miles. I heard 18 in the presentation now from Bald Head Island. Any thoughts on that?
Happy to start, and Jennifer, if you want to jump in. Yeah, so I know that question can oftentimes come up in the context of the Kitty Hawk wind energy area that is 24 nautical miles offshore. That setback was a provision that came out of Bodie Island Lighthouse having National Park Service protection that protects it from development both offshore and onshore. So it's a unique set of circumstances that protect that lighthouse. There are tens of, we actually have, I just sent a link in the chat of our visualization resources if anyone wants to take a look at those simulations. Part of that informational packet that you'll find on our website shows tens of historic lighthouses up and down the East Coast in their proximity to wind energy areas, all of which are far closer than, say, Old Baldy, and certainly Bodie Island Lighthouse. I think in the range of approximately 12 nautical miles is the average from those historic lighthouses. And then generally speaking, just distance, wind energy areas, distance from shore. The majority of them on the East Coast are closer to shore than Wilmington East is. I think it's, again, I believe there's somewhere in the ballpark of 23 to 25 existing wind energy areas in various stages of development and evaluation. And it's about 15 or 16 that are all closer than Wilmington East. So yeah, just for a little bit of context for the other projects that are under development.
And I know recently you had a presentation down at the Southport Community Building. This question kind of goes to that. It's the Wilmington East potential of 122 wind turbines. Will they take up a lot of ocean land? And what about the lights and the noise?
Sure. So I'm not entirely positive. Amber, you might even know this off the top of your head about standard spacing, or what's being anticipated. Obviously, there's not much standard at the moment with just 7 turbines, but what we're anticipating for spacing for projects that are under development. In terms of lights, current industry standard technology uses lights or lighting technology that only turns on in the presence of, say, avian species or airplanes, aircraft, and things of the like. So the impediment on like, say, the night sky is quite infrequent or minimal.
Yeah, I'll jump in on spacing quickly. So right, like we're not exactly sure what we'll see in these project plans, and there's an opportunity to influence them. I know in the Northeast, there was a lot of advocacy from the fishing community that resulted in 1 mile transit lanes really kind of landing as the norm in these initial projects, and also having adjacent projects align their grids so that those transit lanes, you know, don't get jumbled from project to project. But 1 mile distancing is probably most likely at this point in time.
Amber, while I've got you, the next question was dealing with the top seismic testing. And I think in your presentation, you talked about that a little bit, the sub-bottom profiler versus the seismic gun, was it?
Yeah.
Could you kind of expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. So I mostly want to reassure that these seismic air gun arrays compared to the sub-bottom profilers that are used by offshore wind survey vessels cannot be compared. We're talking about assessing miles beneath the seafloor versus assessing a couple of meters beneath the seafloor. So the need, the volume, I mean, you can just imagine the difference in volume and intensity. So it's a different technology, and then it's a different scale. The activity around the seismic activity with the air guns for oil and gas exploration is tens of thousands of times stronger than the activity for offshore wind exploration.
Thank you very much. Does anyone that is attending today, do you have any questions for the panel? You can post those in the chat so that I know that you have a question. I'm not seeing any questions at this time. So does the panel have any other information that it would like to expand on at this time?
I might ask one more question of Amber or Jaime, but maybe Amber. A lot of environmental groups, environmental support groups that might have opposed offshore drilling. And I know you can't speak for other groups, but in terms of that area of nonprofit, of environmental nonprofits, are you finding that those who might have opposed offshore drilling are leaning more towards supporting offshore wind, or what's that dynamic? And I don't expect you to speak for the industry, but just based on your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I can speak for National Wildlife Federation. I mean, we do work in close partnerships with a lot of other environmental organizations at the state and federal levels. So I can say for us and broadly for the community that, I mean, we oppose offshore drilling and we support offshore wind. So our organization fits into that category, as do many others. Really offshore wind is the thing we can say yes to, right? Like the environmental community is often in the position of saying, no, let's do this instead. This can be the responsible form of offshore energy production. It's not extractive. The wildlife impacts, as I mentioned, cannot be compared. The risks cannot be compared. So everything comes with an impact, but the impact of offshore wind development from a wildlife perspective and from a climate perspective is entirely eclipsed by that of oil and gas development offshore. So the place where I think there's overlap in maybe opposition or skepticism is certainly in groups that aren't necessarily climate focused, but really are like species and habitat protection focused exclusively. So if there's an organization that their exclusive goal is to protect marine mammal populations, then marine mammal populations are threatened by climate change. So it does present a challenging dynamic, but maybe their standards of wildlife protection would be even greater because they're not necessarily hooked to the success of the offshore wind industry, whereas where NWF falls is like, we set these really high standards. We also hope the industry will meet them so that we can advocate for it to be successful. So, there's a variety in the community for sure, but I think the drilling and offshore wind dynamic is fairly unifying in that we largely oppose one and support the other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We do have I'm sorry, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, and yes, we can get that. I want to make sure I ask Jennifer, and I'm sorry if you reviewed this, but when you're reviewing the tower group, the committee that will kind of be shepherding the responsible development of offshore wind in the state, would you just touch on the fishing industry members that sector that are represented? Not names, just the groups.
I'd be happy to, Susan. I would note that a high-level representative from the Department of Environmental Quality's Division of Marine Fisheries, who in that agency and that division specifically are responsible and have jurisdiction over how we responsibly manage our fishing stock off the coast. And so we have a representative from DEQ specifically on fisheries. And we also have the executive director of the North Carolina Fisheries Association represented on NC Towers. And, to the question before with regards to like environmental and other NGOs, The North Carolina chapter president of Audubon is also on the task force, as well as a representative from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, who has a broader jurisdiction over all environmental potential impacts, not just fisheries, but all of the programs under the agency's jurisdiction. And Susan, I'm sorry, or Karen, if you want, I can try to address the question that came in the chat with regards to, trying to mitigate fishing disruption. The suggestion about possibly constructing artificial reefs in and around that area to help compensate for any of the construction that I guess would take place in the foundations and tower construction and operations. I think that pretty much anything is potentially on the table when a project is first under like siting and early development. I would note that specifically in the leasing documents that BOEM executes with a developer, there are strict terms, conditions, and stipulations that are set out in those documents that the developer is essentially signing on to comply with. One of those standard operating conditions that a lessee, a developer would have to meet pursuant to a lease is to conduct ongoing stakeholder engagement with fisheries stakeholders. The lessee is directed to develop a publicly available fisheries communications plan within about 4 months of executing the lease. And that plan has to describe the strategies by which the lessee would intend to communicate with fisheries stakeholders prior to and during activities that support and are congruent with the site assessment phase. And again, the leasing only permits a developer to create a site assessment plan and pursue the activities that allow them to better understand and research the potential area for project development. That fisheries communications plan has to include contact information for the individual who the developer has retained to serve as the primary point of contact with all of the fisheries stakeholders, and that's referred to as a fisheries liaison. And that is their sole job, is to work with all fisher people, forgive me for maybe not using the right term, but to ensure that their concerns and issues are heard, considered, and addressed. And the communications plan that the developer puts together has to include a strategy and the timing of those discussions that take place with stakeholders with respect to how they're going to address conflicts with the designs. And they also have to prepare a project website such that the information ongoing that's shared with stakeholders and that the stakeholders share with the developer can all be posted publicly in an available space. The lessee is also directed to provide some semi-annual reports to BOEM as the lessor on the progress that it makes on the stakeholder engagement, and identify. And I would just note that they have to identify the users who might be potentially impacted by the proposed development, what engagement activities had taken place during that reporting period, and a description of any efforts to minimize or mitigate conflicts that are identified through those discussions. I would also just note that this engagement that's required pursuant to developing the site assessment plan does not stop when that is completed. It continues through the construction and operations phase, or construction operations plan phase of the project. And so essentially it's just the beginning of ongoing engagement and conversation with the fisheries community, as well as other interested stakeholders. But there is a specific call out for a developer to work with fisheries in their pursuit of projects.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions that we have in the chat. So it's about 10:20, so we're going to wrap it up. And Susan, do you have anything else you would like to add at this time?
No, this is exactly, I mean, I've been on a lot of offshore wind webinars, but I learned a whole bunch of new things today, especially about the environmental considerations and the fishing industries. I really want to thank all our speakers for joining us, and Lars from Block Island. Thank you for that perspective from a Chamber of Commerce perspective that has kind of been there and done that. So, and then we hope to see everyone back on March 16th at 9 a.m. I did put the link for that in the chat. Everyone's, the speakers who spoke today, their contact information is also on the chat. Please reach out to them and send Karen all of your questions for the 16th. So thank you, Karen, once again for hosting us, and we can't wait to be back on the 16th.
Yeah, we appreciate all the presenters today and the speakers and sharing their time and all their information that they have. I found a lot of good information as well in there that I had not heard before. And Lars, it's good to talk to another chamber director all the time. I don't get out much, so yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you to Susan for assembling this wonderful panel with the Chambers for Innovation and Clean Energy. They've been a really good sound partner on putting this information together. And I am so looking forward to the March 16th day for our presentations on job creation and economic development. I think that's really key. And we're looking forward to learning more about how we as a community can position ourselves properly. So thank you again, and hope everybody has a very profitable day, and we'll see you on March 16th.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Karen.
Thank you.